when people say this is truly fascism raising its head, they're exactly right. Mm-hmm. That's exactly what it is. Period.
Right.
You can't shy away from that. It's, read about it on Auschwitz.org. It's shocking how close we are to literally a Holocaust against a chunk of the United States citizens. And this is the United States. We're supposed to have freedom. When you're talking life and death, you have to vote against death.
Welcome back to Deep Dive with me, Sean C. Fettig. So it's been a few months since we've had a Deep Dive episode, and we're back, and you're going to notice a few changes. So let me tell you what's going on. First, we're doing away with the season structure. I really want to focus on tracking topics of interest in their own time and releasing them only when they're ready. So from now on, no more seasons. And we're also doing away with the weekly release schedule. Instead, episodes will release, as I mentioned a second ago, when they're ready. This could mean that there's a run of episodes that release weekly, and there may be times when episodes release more sporadically. This is, incidentally, all the more reason for you to head to Spotify or Apple Podcast or Stitcher or Amazon, wherever you get your podcasts, and follow Deep Dive for alerts when episodes are released. And while you're at it, give it a like. It really makes a difference for exposure. And there are two more changes I want to tell you about. It probably, hopefully, hasn't escaped your attention that the queer community, particularly the trans community, has come under pretty heavy fire from Republicans in the United States, but also globally as anti-queer hysteria is growing. This is my community, and I've been thinking a lot about our individual responsibility to stand up in the face of hatred and cruelty, violence, misogyny, and homophobia, especially in times like these, when some of the rhetoric and legislation and action coming from the Republican Party and its far-right supporters poses an existential threat to my people. And one thing that I can do is pivot here on Deep Dive to help elevate and showcase the diversity, the strength, the beauty, and the value that my people, the queer community, inhabit and contribute. So, into the future, Deep Dive will be focused primarily on queer-related content. And this may mean some banning in places like Florida and Texas and Tennessee, pretty much anywhere below the Mason-Dixon line, but I'm happy to wear that. Badge of honor. I'm also adding a bit of lightheartedness to these episodes, because while I 100 believe that it is critical to highlight the shit being heaped on the queer community, I also think there's ample time and a need to take a breather. So, Duncan Tucker, you might remember him from the first season of Deep Dive when I interviewed him about his movie Transamerica, will be joining me at the end of each episode to answer a spontaneous question from me that could be related to anything I want to hear him pontificate on. A caveat, though, that begins not today, but with the next episode. Okay, so let's talk about today's episode. I'm opening the episode talking to Ann Thomas, founder, CEO, and manager of Transgender Talent, an independent production company and talent management for trans performers and artists. We talk about the entertainment industry, how it's changed, and in some ways how it hasn't, challenges that trans performers and artists experience in the industry, why it's important to support these artists, and how you can do that. And then I'm talking to friend of the pod, Dr. Sara Benesh of the University of Wisconsin Milwaukee, our resident judicial scholar here at Deep Dive. Given the hellscape that the judiciary is bringing down on the United States, and after a particularly eventful week last week, I have a lot of questions for Sara, and so we're going there. And as I said, please find, follow, and like Deep Dive wherever you get your podcasts. And also follow Deep Dive on Instagram at Deep Dive with Sean, and on Post at Deep Dive Sean. Okay, let's do a deep dive. Ann Thomas, thanks for being here. How are you?
I'm doing wonderful. Thank you so much.
Let's just jump right in, but let's start at square one, because you could say I'm ancillarily involved in the entertainment industry, but I mean, for all intents and purposes, I'm not, and you are. So my first question is, what is a talent agency, or what does a talent agency do?
Okay, we're actually a talent management firm. A talent agency is a different kind of animal than we are.
Okay.
Talent management firm preps the actors and helps them present the information to the industry about how they want to be presented, and in terms of getting all their advertising material together. That's the best way to look at it, because that's what a reel is. I'm sure you've heard of a reel. Mm-hmm. Actors have them. Other people do too. And then resume, headshot, biography, all that stuff needs to be presented in a cohesive package. And so that's what a manager does, is prep them for that. And then we are very different than all the other talent managers in Hollywood, literally different than all of them. We've found out over the years. An agency takes and pitches the actors to casting directors, who then evaluate them and see if they'll fit the role. And so that's the difference between agent and manager. But unfortunately, all the other managers in Hollywood's also double up as being agents too. Mm. And so they're trying to pitch folks as well from the very beginning. We do some of that, but not the way the other ones do. What we do is to get the lead roles in any project, whether it's a feature film or like a lead a series regular in a TV series, you have to get the actors in front of the creative staff before it gets funding, typically. And so that's where all your main roles get to be happening. And so people who do that are at a higher level in Hollywood. There are some agents and managers that never do that. We do. We also put together entire groups of folks to do projects. So that's called packaging. And packaging is where you bring in not just the actors, but the director, the producers, the writer. Everybody comes together. You build the team and add more people to it and create a project around that. And then you take that project to funding, to the finance people. And so we do that. And so in a way we do pitch our people, but everybody in Hollywood pitches tries to do packaging. Even the publicists do. And so they're really well connected in the industry. All your major agencies do all of that stuff that I mentioned. So like CAA, UTA, William Morris, all of those. They do the packaging, they do the work of a manager and the work of an agent, and then they have whole divisions in their company for that. Plus they do producing. So they produce projects. We do too. So we have, and that's really common amongst managers. They usually have a production division to their company.
So you answered some of this. Tell me about Transgender Talent. And I guess in doing so, from concept to, like its history and its growth and where you are today.
Well, we started out because we were asked to. I was on Glee in episode 607, which was the episode where Coach Beast came out as trans and came walking out and was surprised on the stage with this gigantic choir. And in that choir, there was 197 of us. That's the actual count that was announced by the production people when we were there. The lines in the show say, "Oh, we've got 300." Yeah, no, there wasn't 300. There was closer to 200. But anyway, I was placed right behind Marie Jones for the scene. So I got famous really fast. And people started coming.
I remember that scene, actually.
Yeah, I'm literally right behind her right shoulder.
Okay.
And I'm calling her because Dot is a cisgender woman playing the role of a trans man. Mm-hmm. So I got to know Dot, not as Coach Beast. So anyway, so what happened was I met up with a casting director shortly after that, and Sandy Alisi is her name, and she basically said, that took us forever to get all those people. We had to call all the LGBT centers all over the United States, and it took us a lot of effort to get the people there. A lot of people had to fly in, and I met many of them. They came from New York and Texas and places like that, Arizona, flew in from all over. And she was like, it's just about impossible to find people. What can you do to help? Is there a way you can set something up so we can find you guys easier? So that's when I came up with the idea of doing a listing service. Originally is what it was. And then we started with about 35 people or so out of that choir. And then I started really digging deep to figure out where I fit as a business in Hollywood. We eventually, I was working with a partner at the time who since left, who shortly thereafter actually left the company and went stealth. Actually, they're gone, off the radar. we were investigating how do we fit in the industry. So we looked at the difference between an agent and a manager, and we found that agents have a lot of legal restrictions on them. I would not be able to do this podcast as an agent, most likely. So as a manager, I can go on camera. I can talk about stuff. So I decided to go the route of the manager instead. And so that's where we were birthed from. At first, when we started, there was very, very few casting calls that came out. Like once every few months, we get one. And then it started gaining momentum, and we got a casting call that came in for an ABC series called Wicked City. And that's what kind of got the attention of Hollywood when they gave us that request. And I heard about it. I wrote into casting, and they said, sure, send us your people. And I said, I'd be happy to, as long as you send me the script first, because before this point, you guys have been doing nothing but giving us roles that were either mass murderers or absolutely evil people or the butt of a joke, stuff like that, or a dead body under a towel, or a blanket. And it's like, this has to end. We are people with a much wider range to us. So the casting director wrote me back and was like, well, sure, I'd be happy to. Let's get on a call and talk. So we talked a little bit. They were quite shocked at what I was doing, because nobody in the industry had ever said that to a casting director before and required that the script be approved. And so they were really, really shocked at that. And so we progressed into it. We submitted a whole bunch of people, and nobody got even a call back out of that. And then about 6 months later, I get an email from the same guy again saying, hi, I've been watching ever since. And actually a bunch of us have. And we noticed that you people aren't getting callbacks. And that's because we realized that your people don't know how to do auditions. And you guys have been submitting more trans people than the whole rest of the industry combined for any of the transgender roles that have been put out. And so he said, I'm offering you free auditioning lessons for all of your people and any other trans people you can bring in, because it can't just be for your company and your clients. It needs to be for everybody. So I agreed to do that. The guy who wrote it was actually the vice president of the Casting Society of America at the time. And so he's very powerful in the industry. And so we did a training session for 70 transgender actors for free over about a 2-day period. And we had some of the top casting directors in the industry there to teach that. And that's something you never get when you go into an audition in person, is you don't get feedback from the casting director. It's like, okay, let's do they might ask for adjustments and all that, but you never hear what's going on in their head. So this was an opportunity to, learn some lines, do a scene, and actually hear what was going on inside the casting director's head. And it was very impactful for everybody. And that was about 6 years ago we did that, I think.
I don't know if represent is the right word, but you represent a huge range of, performers.
Yeah. We started out with just on-camera acting, and then we expanded to voiceover. And that was by the request of a major agency. They came to us and said, can you start this division for us and bring people to us? Because we don't like what we're seeing right now. This was like several years ago. They said, we have these people coming in the door who they look to us to be girls who've shaved all their hair off and all they have is a buzz cut, and they claim to be trans. We can't tell. And we're not legally allowed to ask any of those questions. See, as a company that's focused on a minority group, it's okay for us to vet the people and make sure they're a member of that minority group.
Right.
Because what would happen is if casting casts somebody who claims to be in a minority group, and then it comes out later that they weren't, they could get sued for misrepresentation. So could the agency, and so on. It's a legal nightmare. So they need to be able to somehow verify that people really are transgender, or that they're of a particular race or religion, whatever. They need to be able to verify that. But federal employment laws prohibit that. It's the same laws that keep people from being fired for being trans that work at Starbucks or at McDonald's as it does to protect actors. So, and in reality, any actor can get cast to play any role, even if they don't match any of the criteria that have been specified in the casting call.
Mm-hmm. So there's two things that you touched on, both related to representation, that I want to dig into a bit. And so here's the first thing. You mentioned Dot Marie Jones playing Coach Beast in Glee. And this is a cis actor playing, a trans character. And this makes me think of like Jeffrey Tambor in Transparent and Felicity Huffman in Transamerica. And so I'm wondering how you feel about cis actors playing trans characters.
That's a mixed bag, because I see both sides of the argument that there's much more authenticity if you have somebody who's a member of a minority group playing that role, such as even much more recently, there was some famous actress, Oscar-winning actress, I believe, who was a Gentile who was playing a Jewish character. So this kind of thing isn't just limited to trans versus cis in casting. It's a lot of topics. Very common to see Native American roles being played by non-Native Americans. Things like that are happening and have been happening since the dawn of the industry, and it comes back to the time of Shakespeare where you had men playing women.
Which apparently is illegal in Tennessee now.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. So I guess you can't have a Shakespeare festival there anymore.
No, I guess not.
That was great. So basically, what it comes down to is that when you're pitching a show, like I talked about earlier, where you bring this package to financing, it's actually the finance people who tend to give a bunch of feedback and say, I don't like they'll say something like, I don't like the script, you need to change this facet of it. I don't like the casting, you need to change that because we're not going to get enough, we can't raise the funds for this through, most of the larger budget stuff is paid for by like hedge funds and stuff like that. And so it's all money oriented. So I get that you're not going to get the story out there without a major name attached. So it really, to me, comes back to the writers. Why are the writers doing this to where you can't build an ensemble that works? For example, in many, many, many times, and it's been done just countless times ad nauseum, going back decades, they'll bring somebody into a cast who is a nobody, absolute nobody, in terms of Hollywood's interpretation of their career at the moment. And they'll put them in a role, and then they'll surround them by a bunch of seasoned actors of name who will attract the audience. And they get the funding for that. And so why not build the story so that you can bring in an actor that is not of name to play the trans roles and surround them by actors of name? They could do it, but it comes back to the writers not really investigating trans and investigating stories. So that's part of why we started a consulting division, to help bring that to light, because there's actually a lot of cis writers out there who come up with stories about trans folks, and they come to us and go, hey, we need help with this, and so we'll, match them with a consultant that actually fits the story. That's one of the other problems. There's a lot of trans people running around going, I consult on stuff in film and TV. Yeah. You don't put a white trans man on a project with an Asian trans woman as the key center role and in an Asian culture. That don't fit, or you don't put somebody that just doesn't match we look for the race, the education level, the income level, all that kind of stuff as factors and the consultants that we bring to projects. So that way you're not just bringing in somebody who claims to be an expert. It's like, no, you're not. You're not an expert on this. So we try and bring folks in for that. But what we're finding, probably it's up to like 50% of the time now, is when we get approached by major folks in Hollywood looking for consultants, we end up getting attached as producers on the show, executive producers or producers, because we have a production division. And so we can do the casting, we can and make sure that it's done right, and then we can help add the nuances to the script that need to be there, And we make sure that we bring in other major name people to surround them in an ensemble cast that will then get financing. Plus, we're working on getting financing together for these projects. So it's like we do it. We try and do it all to circumvent all those problems that they keep running into. That's really what it comes down to.
Given kind of evolving, I suppose, visibility and standards over time, do you or could you feel differently about this now than you might have 30 years ago?
Oh, yeah. Yeah. I mean, I'd say when I first started the company, I found out that for about the prior 20 years, the same tiny group of actors, there was only like a dozen or maybe 20 trans people who played all the trans roles for like 20 years. It's a small group. And so you had no options for a role. You were stuck with what you had. And part of it is the fact that none of them were really making it. I mean, some had some degree of success. There's 2 or 3 that got some good film credits and good TV credits, but nothing like what we're seeing today. And what we see today isn't that good either, to be honest with you. There's nobody A-list, for example, that's trans. I know some people go, oh, but what about Laverne Cox, or what about so-and-so? They've got like a whole laundry list of people. Well, there's actually a list of things you have to check off to become A-list, to even be considered to be part of that. And one of those is play a lead in a successful theatrical release feature film. And 3 of them. You need to have done 3 before you're even considered to be on that list. We don't have any actors who've done that. There's nobody who's even taken the first step. And so we're trying to work towards that with multiple feature films in development currently that would springboard some of these folks forward into that. But then there's also other lists besides A-list. Every single financial organization, every studio, and every television network has what they call the list. And that's the bankable stars that they feel are bankable that fit their audiences. And that list is different from one to the next. That's actually the more important list to be on than A-list. A-list is more like a popularity contest to get on it. Whereas bankable stars is ones that, we can hire Tom Cruise. You're going to get a lot of people filling theater seats to watch him,
Yeah. And this is like news to me. And maybe that makes me wonder if it would be news to the average listener as well, or the average consumer, that you can essentially quantify A-list. Because I think on our end, A-list is kind of subjective, and we just have a sense of like A-list means, really well known or et cetera. And it makes me wonder if for marginalized communities, and here we're talking about like the queer community specifically, the trans community, if A-list means something different to the community than it might mean to the population or the consumer at large.
True.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. Because everybody thinks, they're the most popular trans person out there.
And in that sense, Laverne Cox is A-list, right?
Yeah, in that sense. But A-list actually is a list of people who get invited to the premieres and to the private showings to try and get voters for the different awards. That's where they go most of the time, because the whole way that the award shows work is not a level playing field. It's the people who have the distributors who pay the most money to do big parties. That's why they attach major people to the lead roles in these things, because it's in their contracts that they have to go to these promotional parties if their film or TV series gets chosen for what's called a for your consideration campaign. So you'll see billboards all over LA, for your consideration, and it has some project listed on it. And so you don't know which one's going to get chosen until you get towards the end of the award season for selecting them at the distributor level. They pick which ones are going to go out there for that. And then they do all these parties and stuff like that. And they want the A-listers to be there because everybody wants to be photographed with that A-lister. So it's like a big honeypot with a bunch of flies coming to it. I hate to describe it in that term, but that's literally what it's like.
I mean, some of the recent exposés make it feel that way for sure.
Oh yeah, and some people became masters at it. Like Infamous Harvey Weinstein. He became brilliant at doing FYC campaigns. And that's why his films became popular. That's why he was able to book major stars into the films he was doing. And so when you learn that combination as a producer and working with the distributors, you can go a long way.
Something else that you mentioned earlier that I want to dig into is the portrayal of queer folks, specifically trans folks. But I want to preface this, so bear with me. So this is no shock, right? That, the art industry kind of ebbs and flows. And I think in doing so, it creates like niche markets that also kind of come and go, right? Some things are hot until they're not. And so I guess I'm wondering if we consider that in relation to what seems to be happening. And, I made a joke about this with Tennessee, but in some particularly red states in the United States, we're seeing two things that are happening. Like politically, trans-related issues have been coming under like pretty heated attack at the same time that queer entertainment content is growing and proliferating. And so that makes me wonder then about its staying power or the tension in there. In an environment where these two sides of society are in conflict, what that means then for the future of exposure and visibility for trans folks. Because like you said, in past, when the queer community was like misunderstood and maybe hated by the vast majority of society, when that coalesced with the same sentiment in our politics, then, we saw depictions of queer folks and trans folks in TV and movies reflected that way. So, queer people were victims or victimizers or violent or mentally unstable, as you mentioned. But, the dynamic is different now. So I guess I'm wondering, do you get the sense that the industry is investing in this content and then supporting queer artists? And here we're talking again about trans artists in the long run and in a positive way, or is this potentially a niche bubble?
People have been debating that since I started my company, to be honest with you. I've been hearing that same questioning for 8 years now. And it seems to have leveled off and has been going down. I heard recently from somebody that there's 17% less LGBT characters in projects over the last year than in prior years. So it seems to be on the decline, and that is reflected in what we're seeing in the hiring of our actors. We are seeing a decline, but that's why we are really launching hard on our production division to give these people jobs. But there's never been that many to begin with. The last time we did a head count, there was about 500 trans actors in the industry. Now that's as compared to the 1 million plus profiles on Actors Access, which is the site you go to find actors that the industry goes to. So they can get just about anything they dream up going to Actors Access as long as it's not trans. They're just not going to get that many possibilities, or as they call them, options for roles. But honestly, in the long run, I expected a pushback, although it's even more severe than I expected. And I don't think we are anywhere close to the bottom yet. I think it's going to keep getting worse and worse and worse. But realize that the laws that are being passed by these various states are not a whole lot different than what were repealed recently. And a lot of people don't realize this. I talked earlier about how there was 20 or so trans people who played all the roles for decades. I rep 3 of those now. One of them, actually, I've heard stories of the past from all of them. One of them that's the most interesting is Maximiliana, who was, many people know as one of the lead performers at the fabled Queen Mary nightclub in Studio City that shut down in, I think it was the early 2000s or mid 2000s. That show was epic, and it was, the interesting part was they had a back room, and right now there's a nightclub there called Sarah's. So it's right at the corner of, Whitsett and Ventura Boulevard. There's a back room to it that was the only place in the county that, by agreement with the LA Sheriff's Office, that trans people were allowed to dress as themselves. That was it. Anywhere else you walked in the county as a trans person in the way you identified by gender, you could be arrested and thrown in jail for that.
Right.
And that was only repealed in like 2002 or 2003. That's not that long ago. And so a lot of people don't realize that that's what was going on, even in the quote unquote liberal city of LA. So honestly, these rules that are being thrown out there are nothing new. They've been trying to, they used to be there. And a lot of these old folks now, the damn boomers, as I call them, who are, and I'm one of them, who are in control, are pushing all this stuff back out there again, which was stuff that they grew up with, and they want to see it back in power. So this is it's a matter of what are we going to do with this? And they're actually trying to push beyond where those limits were. I think the best thing for all of us to do is to spread the word for people to read the history of LGBT on the website Auschwitz.org. That's the website for the concentration camp in Poland where millions of people were murdered. Okay? They have a hell of a good explanation and history of all the steps that the LGBT people were taken against the LGBT community pre-World War II and through World War II. And the steps that the current political people are on right now are way into the process. It's like only a step or two short of an annihilation. And that's even been called for by that dodo who said, we need to eradicate trans people. That's exactly the next step. There is not much more that you can do before you literally start killing people or putting them, they'll say, oh, we'll put them we'll incarcerate them. Well, they used to have rules like that in the early 70s. In the early 70s, if you decided to declare that you were trans, you either had to be in many parts of the country, you had to be under the care of a psychiatrist or be incarcerated in jail for saying that. Period. You had no options. You couldn't live openly. And so that was shot down that was because of a research project done by a psychologist in a gender clinic. And that was debunked because he was claiming it was a mental illness. That was first debunked in 1972 by the American Medical Association. This is how old this information is that these anti-trans and anti-LGBT people are building their case from. It's research from the 1950s and 1960s that's been soundly debunked by thousands of research projects since then. And they're pulling all this crap back out. And it's like, people get over it. And so by spreading the word and getting people to realize how far out there this stuff really is that is being foisted upon voters, that they would stop, they would put an end to it. I mean, who in their right mind would vote for the next Holocaust? Nobody. Absolutely nobody. And that other Holocaust was tied in between the LGBT community and the Jewish community very tightly, because the guy who did most of the research back then was a gay Jewish doctor in Berlin named Dr. Hirschfeld. And so they tied the anti-Semitism in with anti-LGBT at the time. So there's a lot of history there that people need to dig out and realize that when you start seeing the massive increase in anti-Semitic attacks in this country and the anti-LGBT attacks coming out, when people say this is truly fascism raising its head, they're exactly right. That's exactly what it is. Period.
Right.
You can't shy away from that. It's, read about it on Auschwitz.org. It's shocking how close we are to literally a Holocaust against a chunk of the United States citizens. And this is the United States. We're supposed to have freedom. When you're talking life and death, you have to vote against death.
Well, so this begs the question then, in the work that you do, on the visual side of things, TV and film, they are filmed in many different locations, and many of them are in some of these red states. And musicians, part of the job is touring, and that includes potentially states that are becoming hostile to the people that you represent or work with. And so I assume that, that's on your mind, or that you're having those conversations, but I'm wondering what those conversations look like in terms of representation for these folks then.
Well, what I have figured out is the best thing to do is reach the middle of the road people who still have some sense left, because all these folks pushing for these extreme laws have their minds made up, and they've somehow convinced the people in their parties that the getting political action committee money is more important than lives. And so keeping their jobs and their power is more important than anything else, regardless of what choices that it completely eliminates for a big chunk of the population. What to me is more important is to get the population that's voting these people into office to realize what they're voting for. And so, yeah, you still need to go on tour in the red states. You still need to broadcast your shows in the red states, but you have to present it in a way that it attracts a broad audience and not just focus on, okay, we're going to make trans content and it's only going to be seen by LGBT audiences. Mm-hmm. That doesn't work because that's preaching to the choir. We need to get out to the mainstream audiences, the ones in the middle, because there's far more of them undecided or on the fence or being pushed one way or the other than the extremists who are trying to push either the extreme left or right positions. It doesn't matter which way you are. The extremists pushing their agendas are way out on the fringes. The rest of us don't want to live in those environments in our minds and whatever. We just want to live our life. We want peace. Mm-hmm. We're not going to get peace if we follow any extreme. We need to just, have a lot of compassion and support for everybody around us who's different than us. Mm-hmm. And so it's way more. And so, yeah, I think that to withdraw entertainment from those states will create a void that will then get filled by people who are more on the extreme end of the spectrum, because they'll see that opening and go, oh, I can book a show in that Coliseum because nobody's going to be there for like a month because, all these famous stars canceled their tour dates there because It's a red state.
Earlier you mentioned, or we talked about cis actors playing trans characters. And then you just mentioned playing to your community. And I guess that makes me wonder the reverse of this, which is, when it comes to like theater, TV, and film, there are obviously opportunities for trans folks to play trans folks or trans characters, right? And then there are opportunities for trans folks to play cisgender roles. So a trans woman to be in the role of a cis woman or a trans man to be in the role of a cis man. And these two things are very distinct. These roles are very distinct from each other. And I'm wondering, from your perspective, are you seeing one more than the other? And I guess an extension of that is, are your clients interested in one role more than the other?
Well, if you cast trans actors as only trans characters, the number of roles offered per year is dismal. And there's not enough of those roles to basically create a living, to have it be a living for any actor virtually. There's very, very few of them. And so, I can count on one hand the number of actors who are playing roles like that on an ongoing basis that are able to just focus on that and not have to work at Starbucks or at McDonald's or someplace else to make a living. So they have to be able to play cisgender roles. So we've been pushing for that for years, but we also keep coming across people who, though they have good intention, they're trying to push behind the scenes at the industry to create more trans roles. We had one instance where an actor was already cast for a role and it hadn't been declared if it was cis or trans. We had some activists come in and try and push the production to change it to be a transgender role. And the actor himself is like, I don't want this to be a trans role. I want it to be a cis role so it shows that I can do that. Otherwise, I'm being typecast, stereotyped and all this stuff. I don't want that. I want to be the character to be a cisgender guy. And so production, the director agreed with them and went with that. And so they created, they added that facet to the role that it was a cisgender guy. And so it's disheartening to me that we actually have to fight against the activists within our own community about that. And it really, really is maddening. In fact, it's like, okay, so, on one hand, you're all saying you want trans actors to be able to play cis roles, but then you're trying to push Hollywood the other way and tell them they have to do trans roles. No, that doesn't work with us. In fact, that's a huge slap in the face. We're not interested in working with people like that. So we're not involved in any of those activists that push that. The other thing is that if we get too delineated into who can play what role, we're going to run into a lot of problems in the long run because actors are supposed to play anything. Part of your acting classes when you go is to play, they'll have different parts of their classes where you have to play an animal, somebody's over here playing a snake, another person over there is playing a horse. What's the point? of doing exercises like that if you can't go outside the box you live in as a person? And if you're going to keep constricting the borders down, how are you going to handle it when you want to have somebody play a medical doctor who would have played House, because that guy who played the role wasn't a doctor in real life? And we don't have very many doctors. I don't think we have hardly any medical doctors who can act. So where do we draw the line? I want to see our actors play all roles, anything that comes to them, period.
It seems like you're doing very well, but how can the public support like trans artists or, the entertainment industry in this area, or awareness of trans artistry, et cetera?
Okay, to support us as a people, find different artists, whether they're singers or actors, find their social media and follow it, and read their posts and stuff like that. Like the stuff that helps to build the visibility factor that Hollywood does look at that. So that helps, and that's something anybody can do. It doesn't cost you anything more than a couple minutes of time now and then. Especially if you start following somebody and you see they posted something like it, And then the next thing is, when you're following all that stuff, watch what they're appearing in, see where they're performing, and buy tickets, go to it if it's an in-person event. If it's a streaming thing, then watch it. And honestly, you can cheat on that. If you don't have that much time and you see a lot of them going by, they count, like on YouTube, they count a view as being the first 3 minutes. So just watch 3 minutes of it and then quit if you don't get
It's the same on podcasts. It's like the first 30 seconds or something counts.
Yeah. And so it counts. So just use that, and put autoplay on and watch every video on the person's feed. That's
a good practical suggestion. It really is.
Yeah. And so it can run for hours. You don't have to watch it or listen. Just let it go, and it will help. And then if you see ads going by for products that you actually are interested in, click on them, and if you don't see ads going by for products like that, just start talking about them in your phone calls. Google will pick up on it and start running ads for you about the things you talk about.
No, that's great. That's great advice.
It's sick, isn't it? It's like Big Brother is watching you.
Well, I mean, considering how Big Brother can watch you, that's relatively innocuous.
Anyway, those are definite ways you can do that. When you see, it's like, here's something that was kind of a beef of mine. If you've ever looked at the Nielsen ratings numbers for the TV series Pose, that was one of the biggest trans content shows running for a while. The actual numbers are deplorably low. I mean, they're horrible. There was episodes that were only getting 400,000 views. There was some episodes that got up past 1 million. None of them came close to 2 million. Even watching some of those older shows like that is really important and can help us then have credibility. Because if we look at an actor who was on Pose and their show only had, they were in like 3 or 4 episodes, and those episodes had only like 400,000 views, that's nothing. And it doesn't help the actor's career. But if they're starting to push 1 million views on every episode that we're in, and they're starting to get some attention on by podcasters and other media folks, it helps push their career forward. That's just another little soapbox, is we need to support the stuff that's there.
Okay. Anne, I have a final question for you. Are you ready for it? I'll take that as a yes. What's something interesting you've been reading, watching, listening to, or doing lately? And it does not have to be related to your job.
You'd never believe it, but I look forward to popping into, I jump into the different like reels and videos on YouTube and Facebook and Instagram. They're little short videos. And one of them that just cracks me the hell up every time because it's so cute is there's this couple that does these things where they hang balloons filled with shaving cream in them and they drop them on each other by shooting the balloon at a distance. It's Lindy and Joe or something like that. I forget their names, but the guy is a cop and he's in a uniform sometimes coming home from work and he gets doused with shaving cream. Those two are just incredibly, they're so cute. And they both just love it and they do it to each other. So, the woman will be walking into the living room carrying a basket of laundry, and suddenly she's doused in shaving cream.
Oh my gosh, I've never even heard of this, but
I know, it's just great. They get millions of views on this stuff. And it's
really?
just so funny because it's so lighthearted. They never do anything mean. So there are videos I've seen of couples doing really mean things to each other, and that I don't like. But this couple, they're always just happy, nice. Their whole family participates, you know. And the guy, being a cop, of course, is an excellent shot to shoot these balloons. They could be 2 stories up, and he'll pick them off at just the right moment while the balloon will land on his wife. It's like, holy cow. Anyway, because he's like little dart guns and stuff like that to shoot them. So anyway, that's just my crazy the thing that I like to watch lately is something that mindlessly fun. But you realize how much work they go to set these jokes up. It's like, wow.
And Thomas, this was great. Thanks for taking the time.
You're so welcome. It was wonderful talking with you. Great questions.
Thank you. So last week, some interesting things happened in the world of the United States judiciary. So Dr. Sara Benesh of the University of Wisconsin Milwaukee has graciously returned to help me understand what the hell's going on and maybe just how long we've got left before the fabric of America has rotted into an old threadbare quilt in the attic of liberal democracy. Dr. Benesh, welcome back. Thanks for being here. How are you?
That was quite a statement.
Yeah, it is.
Good. Thanks for having me.
Do you take issue with any of it?
No.
All right. So in an environment historically where we could go quite literally months, if not years, with really no super newsworthy stuff happening in or coming out of Judicialville, last week was a blockbuster.
It was.
A bunch of things happened. So let's knock them out. First, let me say, while I fled the state of Wisconsin, you have remained behind to hold down the fort. And so let me congratulate you on the Wisconsin Supreme Court win last week.
Yes, that was huge.
Yep. So Janet Protasewicz's win solidifies a quote-unquote liberal bench for the next couple of years in the state.
Yes.
And setting aside the obvious that conservative judges and justices seem to be following the lead of conservative politicians through the looking glass, why is this important?
I think it's particularly important in Wisconsin, given the gerrymandered nature of our politics here and the very divided nature of our politics. So those two things in combination mean that the state legislature is really not very representative of what the majority of Wisconsinites are interested in seeing in terms of policy. And so that is offset by a Democratic governor, which exemplifies the divide between the Democrats and the Republicans in our state, but also shows that in a statewide election, Democrats win. And having the Supreme Court bend a little bit more toward the progressive side of politics means that will be afforded at least some protection from some of the excesses that some of the state Republican legislatures across the country have been engaging in. So it's a big deal, and I think it was driven in large part by the court's Dobbs decision, which we've talked about before.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it's also driven by the nature of these gerrymandered state districts.
So let me ask you this. A lot of weight is being given, or a lot of attention is being given to the fact that Janet kind of leaned into her position on abortion.
Mm-hmm.
So there's a lot of hand-wringing at least on the conservative side, that this is unseemly for somebody running for a judgeship in a state where they elect judges. I don't know how I feel about that, because I feel like conservatives do the same thing. I think sometimes they very overtly do this. I think sometimes they very covertly do this. So how much weight do you give to this?
I think it's a convenient argument to make by a side that pretends not to have preferences. I felt like the entire campaign was extremely loud and noisy on both sides, often driven by outside funding. But what struck me, and I think, I've been sort of trying to think about this because I saw some academics get involved in debating about this, about, well, is Janet's behavior, sort of unbecoming of a judge? And, isn't Dan Kelly so much better? And I just don't see a difference between the two, besides the fact that Protasewicz was a little bit more upfront about the fact that she understands that her position on certain kinds of policies and the direction that she approaches the Constitution and the text of statutes from matters. And Dan Kelly doesn't. And I think this is something of a strategy of the conservative coalition right now. And I think it shows up in the Supreme Court and it shows up in the state courts, where they hold on to that mythology of judging that we all sort of used to hold to, that said that these people are something special and can make decisions entirely impartially. And they use that myth to their advantage to argue that what they're doing is just deciding cases on a case-by-case basis on the basis of the text and the founder's intent. And what everybody else is doing is this really crazy political activism. Mm-hmm. And so they've sort of co-opted the mythology of judging in some ways as a way to advertise their judges.
Mm-hmm. Let's talk about two other things that happened last week in the continuing saga of the conservative judicial apocalypse. Dr. Matthew Kacsmaryk, district court judge out of Texas, and I say that tongue-in-cheek because he is no doctor, but he pretends to be one, and Supreme Court Justice Clarence fucking Thomas.
Is that his actual given name?
Yeah, well, we now on Deep Dive refer to him as CFT. But okay, so let's start with Kacsmaryk. So this is a notorious U.S. District Court judge out of Texas, known for super conservative rulings, and they are often not rooted in any really strong legal history or theory. So he issued a ruling invalidating the FDA's approval of Mifepristone, which is one of two drugs that's used in combination to end a pregnancy. It doesn't require an on-site medical procedure. It can be delivered by mail to a person's home, and it's been deemed safe by the FDA for 20 plus years. But here's what I want to talk about. So when it comes to consequential court decisions, what can happen is the general public responds and, raises concerns about things like the court making decisions that are out of alignment with public opinion, or it upends decades, maybe even centuries of established practices. It creates chaos. It feels unfair. It can lead to a negative impact on society or some particular people, etc. And then what happens in some of those same circumstances is that legal scholars and experts may be shrugged because those aren't really the things that the court considers when making decisions. So instead, judges apply some legal theory, some precedent, etc. But in this case, we have a convergence, a general public backlash to Kacsmaryk's opinion, but also the legal community seems kind of uniformly alarmed at the law, or the lack thereof anyway, as it's applied in this opinion. So, Sarah, what say you?
All right. So I have not read the opinion super carefully. So let's start there. I have noted that it has a lot of the catchphrases of the anti-abortion interest groups. And I also note, and I think this is something that you asked me about earlier, that it applies to the whole of the United States rather than just the states that are under the 5th District's control. So I think, there are a lot of reactions that could be made to this decision. I think, first of all, to say that the Administrative Procedures Act is violated, but, we only noticed it now 20 years later, is an interesting take on the legal question. The idea that any of these emergency petitions ought to have nationwide impact is something that my graduate student is studying for her dissertation. A lot of legal commentators are wrestling with this idea that the courts and the judges are making these decisions in a very fast or middle of the night emergency kind of way, and they're having, major consequences on society and so on. So yeah, he's a Trump judge, right? And I think a lot of people are referring to him that way. And it feels like a very activist decision. So sort of that, that mythology idea, is sort of shown to be lacking in actual explanatory capacity once they start making decisions, right?
You did mention something that, it's a question I have, which is, so Kacsmaryk issues this opinion, and it's a blanket opinion that applies to the entire country. And then Judge Rice out of Washington issues, in part a contradictory opinion. So he orders the FDA to continue making Mifepristone available. But, I get what happens here, that two contradictory opinions make the case ripe for Supreme Court consideration. But there's this practical question about the impact of this in the near term, or while it's making its way through the system. So how does Kacsmaryk's decision apply to the entire country, but Rice's only applies to a region or to specific states?
Yeah, I think that's a good question. It's something that I had to really kind of dig for an answer to, because, I think that's important to figure out, right? So why does one district court judge say that this is holding on the entire nation while the other one says something different. And I think, in one respect, it's because the cases are different. The case before the Fifth Circuit was a case attacking the actual FDA approval of the drug and the procedures that the FDA took in approving it. So an injunction against that drug on that basis is, makes sense to be nationwide. At least, you could argue that it makes sense to be nationwide, given that it will affect the entire nation in the same way if it was created in an irresponsible way. Whereas the Washington case was a case brought by a certain number of states that were objecting to a particular 2023 revision to the FDA's approval. And so because that answer to the question that the litigants are asking in that case is different depending on what state you're in, the judge explicitly in his opinion considers the impact of his injunction and decides, or his ruling, and decides that it's only applicable to those 18 states that brought the lawsuit. It might be different states. It could be different circuit precedents because the Ninth Circuit case did cite circuit precedent about when an injunction ought to be considered to be nationwide and when it should be more localized. And it could be that the Fifth Circuit has different precedent. It could just be different judicial philosophies, or it could just be the differences in the two challenges.
How much of this do you think is strategy to ensure that this works its way up to the Supreme Court, although I think it was going to regardless? And how much of this is like Rice really applying what he thinks is applicable law in and answering a question that was directly before him?
I mean, who knows, Sean?
Yeah.
I mean, we're in that realm of, judges doing what they want to do again. I think it's evident to anyone who's watching that the federal courts do what they want to do. So, I think they feel at least somewhat limited by and constrained by some specific legal constraints. And it could be that Rice feels more so than Kacsmaryk. I don't know. I mean, who knows?
It does bring me, though, the court's doing what they want to do, to Thomas. So
he does what he wants to do.
He does. He's a ride or die on his own precognizance. Yes. Anyway, so last week, ProPublica reported, I mean, it's like an expose, frankly. I don't know if you've read this.
Yeah.
But over the past couple of decades, Justice Thomas has failed to disclose some pretty significant gifts he's received. And, we can parse out the disclosure requirements and the language, but almost all legal experts believe that it's clear that Thomas unethically, maybe unlawfully, withheld disclosure of hundreds of thousands, perhaps millions of dollars worth of gifts he received in the form of travel and vacations, all coming from one person. His name is Harlan Crow. I don't know. I cannot say his name without getting this image of it's either a 1950s Southern sheriff or like a Batman villain. But yeah, and maybe it's unfair to Harlan, although what we're now hearing about.
I think it's okay to criticize.
Yeah. But anyway, I don't know if I should be shocked or if I am shocked. I mean, I'm not shocked. So to me, this is kind of part and parcel of what's come or what's becoming of the conservative side of the political spectrum, which is a sense that they can operate with impunity, that they won't be held to account for unethical or illegal behavior. But the court is different from electeds in some important ways. So what does this mean to you, and what can we expect happens or doesn't happen?
Oh, I mean, nothing's going to happen. Obviously there were the calls for his stepping down and, calls for his resignation, which he will never do. Mm-hmm. And then calls for impeachment, which is, impossible with the design of it's not impossible, right? But it's politically impossible. So nothing will happen. I mean, they had just, I guess, revised the disclosure rules, and and those revisions seem to apply to the situation that Thomas was in. Mm-hmm. And so, going forward, he says that he will now report those activities. But, the Supreme Court isn't part of the whole ethics laws. We've always exempted the Supreme Court and trusted the court to do its own policing on these things. And I think that's, dangerous, mm-hmm. especially today, and maybe was always something that was maybe a little bit dangerous. But we're finding out about a bunch of things. So it's not just the Thomas stuff, although that's like huge. It's also the Hobby Lobby leak the conservative, dinner party companions of Alito. And there's, the religious, what is his name? Shank, who has his offices across the street from the court. And then the whole discussion about the Supreme Court Historical Society and the way that it has been used to promote access to the justices by conservative donors. There's even a new paper out. I don't know if you've seen this, but Laura Moyer wrote a paper on concerts at the Supreme Court. There's apparently like a concert series that takes place at the Supreme Court building with the justices in attendance and is funded by corporate donors. Like there's just so much coming out right now about the lack of insulation that we sort of expect from the Supreme Court. And I think it has to make people wonder what happens to decisions. I mean, of course, this guy is not going to be friends with Thomas if they don't agree on a lot of things in life.
Right.
So the idea that will he influence Thomas's decisions, I don't know. It's the same argument with campaign finance, right? Like if you give money to an individual, you're probably already expecting that individual to share some of your values. And so tracing causality is difficult in all of these circumstances, but boy, does it look bad. And we know that legitimacy is important to the Supreme Court. And we know that the perception that the court is political is one of the things that depresses legitimacy. And so I'm not sure how you can watch what's happening at the Supreme Court and not lose faith in anything like that mythology of impartial judging.
Well, speaking of people that are watching this happen to the court, Chief Justice Roberts. So for somebody who has made the court's legitimacy kind of a centerpiece of, his tenure, this has got to be a nightmare.
Yeah, but he's in his own little la-la land, like I don't know I don't think I've seen, he hasn't given a reaction to this, right?
No. Well, Thomas has via the court, but yeah.
Yeah. I don't know what his reaction will be, but so there was a op-ed written just the other day by a academic, Scott Gerber, which was like outrageously Pollyannish. Like it was, the title of the op-ed was Supreme Court Justices Can Have Friends Too. And I'm like, are you kidding me? Of course they can have friends. This is ridiculous, right? The thought that Thomas, who is supposed to be a very learned scholar in the law, looked at disclosure requirements and didn't think he had to disclose this, just demonstrates how little they care about those laws, right?
Well, and he did report this and then stopped reporting it in like 2006. Yeah.
Because it got some negative attention. Yeah. It's beyond comprehension.
So I know you, and I know how much reverence you give to the court system in the United States, how much respect you have for it. What is this all doing? What has the last year done to you? Are you broken?
It hurts, Sean. Yeah, it's really, I think it's just really a remarkable time that we live in. I never expected to see these kinds of things and to learn these kinds of things about the justices and their quote unquote private life and the company that they're keeping. And I maybe underestimated how closely connected conservatives are. Like there just seems to be like a club.
It's kind of creepy, to be honest.
They're all related. Like as soon as you start digging into one of those, like the story with the religious group is related to the story with the historical society, which is related to this guy, Crow guy. They're all the same people. And I'm troubled, Sean.
It's like that interconnected fungus underneath all the trees that like connects all the trees. Like,
yes, it's like that.
Apropos comparison. Hey, so before I let you go, I do want to talk about Harlan Crow for a second. So outside of the kind of horrific collecting, I don't know, his tastes for collections, that picture of Thomas in that ProPublica piece is a painting.
I know. Doesn't that look crazy? Like really real? I
kind of skipped over that.
Mm-hmm.
And then I heard somebody say something like that painting. And I was like, what painting? And I went back and then I was like, oh my God. And it's like, so first of all, he commissioned someone to do a painting.
Yeah. They painter.
Second, it's a weird picture. It's not even like a decent picture to say, I'd like to make this into a painting. It's like a weird, like a child took a picture.
You do that, right? Like a picture that they gave the artist, right?
Yeah. And it's so weird.
Yeah, it's very casual.
Yeah, I mean,
well, it's very much like Thomas holding forth, isn't it? Like, can't you just imagine that he's like, just amazing them with whatever it is that he's saying?
yeah, but I have two responses to that because I agree, yes. But one is there have to be different pictures of the same dynamic where they look better. And
maybe not. Might have just been one picture.
Actually, that's totally possible, right? But the other is, I would imagine as a painter or as an artist, I would do a little bit to make them look better.
I don't know anything about art. It's weird though.
It's weird.
The whole thing is like really, and another weird thing, and I don't know if you saw this or not, but there's a documentary about Thomas, happens to be funded by Crow.
Yeah.
Being taped right now. And he had just gotten done saying that he prefers Walmart parking lots with his RV. He doesn't like those fancy vacations.
Yeah.
And I'm like, what?
I highly doubt like Harlan Crow's in an RV next to him. Like,
no, I don't think.
Let me repay you for all the trips.
No, I don't think he's doing the RV thing. And we know that Thomas did that, and that's like a big shtick that he likes to talk about. But I think he's gotten beyond the RV, and I don't think he's parking him in Walmarts anymore.
No, I highly doubt it.
Not when you can have that, like, what was it? So on the property was a recreation of Hagrid's hut from Harry Potter.
Yes, it's just weird. Like,
so cool.
Like, it's just weird.
I don't know these people. Like this is a lifestyle that I don't understand. Crazy times we live in, my friend.
True that. How's your bunker underneath your house coming along?
Yeah, I don't know what's going to happen.
All right. Dr. Benesh, thanks for being here.
Always a pleasure, Sean.
All right. Here's my final thought. I've been reading The Cruelty is the Point by Adam Serwer of The Atlantic. It's a collection of essays that dig into American history and how the violence, dehumanization, and degradation that is associated with this Trump era is actually deeply rooted in the country's history. It's got me thinking about patterns that might exist between some of America's worst moments and how they connect to some of the horrible things we're experiencing now. I was talking to a friend of mine recently. She's liberal, and she was telling me about her parents who are very conservative, like MAGA conservative. She said that almost every interaction with her parents over the past few years has been tense and contentious, that her parents, her father especially, would berate her whenever they interacted about Donald Trump, evil Democrats, socialism, etc. And this was despite her best efforts to not discuss politics in any way. When she asked her father if they could try to avoid the topic the couple of times they see each other every year, he cut her out of his life. And she said that in the moment that he did, he was so full of rage that she actually thought he could snap and cause real physical harm to her, the amount of hatred he was emanating. And this fits into a pattern that's making itself increasingly clear with today's Republicans, that their hatred of anybody not in their clan, and by this I mean their tight ideological clan, is an enemy, and an enemy worth extinguishing. And this extends to their families. Their love for their own family is conditioned on this. And the manifestations it can take are brutal and violent. To people like me in the queer community, this has always been clear that the stories conservatives tell about the importance of family and unconditional love are just that, stories. These same people have a really seamy history of excommunicating their queer children, often very young children, abandoning them to the streets to fend for themselves. Religious communities have done the same, excommunicating members, including family members, that don't strictly adhere to doctrine. And now we're seeing the same thing happen with Republicans and republicanism, disassociating, withholding love, and abusing even their own blood over political ideological differences of opinion. So one, I think it lays bare the farce that the family unit is inviolable and built on unconditional love. Not true. But two, it's made me think more about how some of the worst of our history must have felt for outgroups in a way that isn't entirely clear or obvious in our more law and orderly society. Hear me out on this. Following the Civil War, I think the South embarked somewhat successfully on a campaign to cloud our hindsight with tales of a genteel antebellum culture built on Christianity, manners, and hospitality and compassion. It romanticizes the South in a way and during a time that tempers maybe the actual history of what Southern culture must have looked like and felt like in an era of slavery and human ownership, subjugation, and oppression. The alternative history fabricated by the South puts a sheen on slavery that, at best, confuses people, seeking a balance between good and evil, and at worst, throws the horrors of slavery in practice into question. That maybe it wasn't all bad, that there was some communal quaint security in it all. What we're seeing today with the modern Republican Party should help anyone vulnerable to this alternative narrative to reject that gloss. Republicans today, not 200 years ago, today, glory in dehumanizing women, pursuing the death penalty for abortion, and demonizing queer people as groomers and pedophiles, and characterizing murder and violence from their supporters in justifiable terms. Churches, which are tax exempt, sponsor militia groups and militia training on their property. These are insurrectionists, white supremacists, nationalists, carrying weapons, training to overthrow the government inside our churches, while also bellowing about the evil queer community and the evil independent woman and the evil Black community. They revel in the pain and cruelty they can inflict on people who hold different opinions from their own. And they pursue all roads available to subjugate the rights of people and groups that they don't like. And this is done in an environment that has guardrails, laws, and rules that ostensibly protect people, victims, and limit or inhibit victimizers. So just imagine how this hatred and this cruelty manifested itself in a time without laws or customs or even personal shame restraining their worst tendencies. Imagine the horrors they unleashed when they could do so with impunity. And then this should help to formulate in your mind the type of world they want. We should not be confused as to the social order they are pursuing and the means they will employ to achieve it. We should all be taking appropriate steps to advance democracy and confront authoritarianism in all of the forms that it takes, at the most minute of local levels, in our schools, in our libraries, in our churches, and in our families. No spark shall take, lest the entire forest burn. This is not a time to bury your head in the sand or tune out or turn a blind eye. We are deep in a struggle for our democracy and our liberty. At the most basic, we can't make it easy for them. All right, stay tuned for more deep dive in the coming weeks. Chat soon, folks.